Have you ever reached a point in your life, maybe after a really long period of challenge or, uncertainty, where you just realize that surviving has become your default mode?
Mm.
And that constant vigilance you've gotten so good at, it starts to feel less like a skill and more like, well, like a cage.
That feeling is the absolute emotional core of the piece we're diving into today. We're looking at the work of Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, specifically a meditation on finding safety called Enough Safety to Breathe, Joy, Coherence, and Gestalt Flourishing.
Right. And our mission here is really to give you the shortcut into Hoerricks' framework. It's a very personal piece,
Yeah.
Born from their own experience over decades.
But the lessons are so universal. We need to unpack this difference between just surviving what they call building islands of regulation and actually truly resting, which they call margin.
I think if you're someone who's mastered that art of, functioning beautifully under intense pressure, but you still can't quite relax when that pressure finally lifts for a second, then this conversation is really for you. This difference between high-functioning survival and real safety, it's everything.
It's the difference between a life lived in conditional terms and one with the possibility of real rest.
And the power of this piece, it just hits you right away in the subtitle. Safety, pleasure, and living long enough to tell the truth.
Yes.
It's like an acknowledgement that just being able to write about this is a hard-won victory. It really sets up the central paradox.
It does, and that paradox is all about the timeline. The author says they're only writing this after 5.5 decades.
5.5 decades.
And that's not a timeline of, triumph. It's a timeline of tenacity. It just underscores that for so many people, survival is not a given.
And that time frame implies something really crucial for us, for the listener. When survival isn't guaranteed, the mind just operates differently.
Right.
Continuity is never assumed. So you don't approach the future with certainty. You approach it consciously, if you even approach it at all. And that leads us to this foundational state.
Yeah.
Life before the breath.
Exactly. We have to start there. We have to define what those decades actually looked like, that necessary, brilliant, but ultimately draining period of pure survival mode.
So let's get into that, the nature of that pre-rest life. For Hoerricks, survival wasn't a temporary thing. It was the baseline, the operating system. It wasn't just that things were hard. It was that the structural assumption of a tomorrow was just absent.
And when that's absent, it changes the very definition of safety. Safety in this phase is something Hoerricks describes as, let me get the words right, episodic, borrowed, conditional.
It wasn't ambient. It wasn't just there.
No, you had to go out and actively find it, secure it, even if just for a few hours.
I find the specificity in the source material here so grounding. They talk about safety existing only in these very particular pockets.
Yes.
Certain rooms, certain relationships, certain objects. And I just want to pause on that for a second because that is so relatable.
Think about what that really means. Your internal calm isn't coming from you. It's dependent on these fragile external anchors.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a specific coffee mug or a blanket or, only feeling okay when you're physically in one particular friend's house.
And if that anchor gets removed,
the safety just dissolves instantly.
So it also means the necessary skill you develop isn't relaxation. It's advanced threat detection.
Yeah.
Mitigation.
Exactly. If the field is hostile, you have to be highly capable of functioning within the hostility.
That's the necessary skill, isn't it? Learning how to build coherence inside instability.
Yes, and creating these small islands of regulation in hostile fields. You become a specialist, an engineer of your own immediate environment. You know exactly what needs to be managed to keep that little island stable.
It's a genius way to put it, but here's a critical question. If the external field is constantly hostile and your survival depends on managing these islands perfectly, well, doesn't that make coherence itself just temporary? How sustainable is that, really?
And that is the pivot point. Hoerricks is very clear. This skill, building those islands, kept me alive. That is a massive achievement.
A huge achievement.
But, and this is the absolute crucial distinction for anyone listening, that very skill, the constant monitoring and regulation, it did not allow me to rest.
That's it. That's the difference between, say, a high-security lock and true peace of mind. The island of regulation keeps the bad stuff out for a bit, but your internal alarm system, your nervous system, is still running surveillance on that island 24/7. You're safe, But you're still perpetually on watch. You can't put your feet up.
And that's the tragedy of pure survival. You survive, but you never fully inhabit your own life because some part of your brain is always on resource allocation and threat assessment. You're always braced.
Okay, so how do we move from that state, that high-functioning but conditional state, to something where rest is actually possible? What does that shift even look like?
This brings us to section 2. The author is so careful here with their words. They say what they have now is not ease exactly.
Beyond ease.
Because ease suggests, a frictionless life, which is a myth. The world is still hard. The word they use is margin.
Margin. That word carries so much weight. What do they mean by margin specifically?
They define it as a little space between stimulus and threat. Margin is the buffer zone.
A buffer zone.
Think about a tightrope walker. They live in constant, intense self-regulation. Every single micro-movement has to be perfect just to stay upright. That is conditional safety.
Right. If they slip even a tiny bit, it's an immediate catastrophe. There is zero margin for error.
Exactly. Now compare that to someone just walking across a wide, stable bridge. That person has margin.
Okay.
They can wobble a little, maybe trip, pause, look around, and they don't instantly fall. The ground is still there, but their relationship to the threat has fundamentally changed because of the available space.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Margin means the consequences of being imperfect are no longer catastrophic.
Yes. You don't have to execute flawless self-regulation every single second just to avoid falling apart. There's a buffer. There's space.
And this space, this margin, is what allows for the physiological revolution.
Yes. The author says it allows enough predictability for the nervous system to stand down some of its watch. And that is the moment of true, profound change.
This is where it gets really interesting for anyone who's lived with chronic vigilance. The difference between conditional safety and margin isn't external, it's internal.
It's all internal.
Conditional safety requires that constant bracing, that low-level muscle tension, the cognitive load. Margin allows for the ungracing. You stop anticipating the impact moment to moment.
You go from constant monitoring to trusting the continuity of your environment, at least enough to exhale. You stop having to achieve safety in these isolated pockets.
And you start to experience it as a state that's just sort of available.
Right.
But Hoerricks is very clear this is a vulnerable state, not a perfect one.
Yeah.
They emphasize that this new reality is not safety in the absolute sense, not immunity.
No, not a world without harm.
So if it's not absolute community, why is it such a breakthrough?
Because it's something, they say, rarer and more fragile than absolute safety. Rarity because of how hard it is to get here. Fragility because, the hostile fields, the past traumas, the current difficulties, they're still out there.
So the breakthrough isn't that the external world changed. It's that the internal response shifted.
Yes.
It's just enough margin, enough internal space to breathe without that reflexive, high-stakes bracing that you needed just moments before. That's the controlled release.
It's the difference between regulation and rest. Regulation is management. Rest is letting go of the need for moment-to-moment management. And when you have enough margin to rest, that changes everything. It even changes the definition of happiness.
And I think that's the most profound leap in the entire piece, which brings us to our third section, joy as coherence sustained. Because for so many who survive, joy it's temporary. It's just a brief flare.
Yes, exactly. For a survivor, joy might be defined as, the brief absence of immediate threat or a temporary high that comes right before you have to go back to monitoring. But Hoerricks offers this deeply philosophical, really earned definition, a joy as coherence sustained.
And what's so fascinating is that this sustained coherence, it doesn't mean simple or easy. It's actually a complicated, integrated kind of piece.
It is.
They describe it with this beautiful metaphor that sustained coherence involves luck, loss, and legacy braided together.
This is so critical because it integrates the past instead of trying to escape it. The coherence isn't pure positivity. It's the understanding of the immense luck it took just to survive.
Right.
The deep and inevitable loss you experienced along the way and the legacy you've built just by enduring and telling the story.
Yeah.
That's a kind of happiness that is complicated and deeply felt and thoroughly earned.
So if I'm tracking this, the margin, that space between stimulus and threat,
Yeah.
that's the mechanism that allows this braiding to even happen.
Yes.
It allows a joy to finally exist without that immediate, deep-seated feeling that it will be punished for overstaying.
Precisely. If safety is episodic, then joy feels like a dangerous violation of your vigilance. It's like lowering the guard. which just invites disaster.
Of course.
Margin changes that equation. It tells the nervous system, you have space here. This goodness can settle. It doesn't need to be immediately liquidated or contained. It can sustain itself.
So what does this all synthesize into? What about this broader concept they named in the title, Gestalt flourishing? That term implies something whole, something complete.
Gestalt flourishing is the culmination of this whole process. It means moving beyond just existing in these isolated moments. It's the realization that continuity is now assumed, at least enough for rest and forward motion. So instead of constantly guarding against the next trauma, you can begin to plan, to dream, to fully inhabit a future that actually feels viable because that foundation, the margin, it's finally there.
It's the move from constantly having to reinforce your tiny isolated islands of regulation to finally feeling safe enough to inhabit the wider sea and actually start building habits of rest instead of vigilance.
That's the perfect encapsulation. Flourishing becomes possible when your default setting shifts from that constant vigilant self-regulation to a state that allows you to weave together the past, the loss, and the luck into the coherence of the present to build a usable future.
Wow. This deep dive into Hoerricks' framework has been, well, it's been transformative. To quickly summarize for you, the listener, we've tracked this profound journey from a conditional episodic safety, which required high-level self-regulation, to a state of genuine margin.
And margin is that space, the space between stimulus and threat, which allows the nervous system to stand down and ultimately allows joy to exist as coherence sustained.
The core takeaway here really is that finding enough safety to breathe involves so much more than just physical survival.
It means moving beyond the constant monitoring that those islands of regulation require. It means accepting that this earned margin, even though it might feel fragile, is what finally gives you the chance to truly rest and to tell your own story.
That is a profound distinction, and one worth carrying with you. And as we leave you to reflect on this, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought, coming directly from the author's intensely personal journey. If survival was never guaranteed for you, and continuity wasn't assumed, what personal pockets, what certain rooms, certain relationships, or certain objects provided you with episodic safety before you found true margin, or maybe, while you were still seeking it, something to mull over until our next deep dive?